Hi everyone, we are back with another article from Library Resources and Technical Services, and I don't know, might be the last one I record for a while. We'll see. But this is Voices from the Field, Library Acquisition Pathways for Indigenous Audiovisual Media by Kathia Ibacache and Arthur Aguilera. Hopefully I did not mess up your last names. And I am going to, as always, skip the little blurb, but this is sort of out of the box for me, back to my first love of AV media. But in this case, we're talking about acquisition, which is not something I'm familiar with. So, should be interesting. It is a little bit longer, but another core chunk of it is tables. So, without further ado, the introduction. Audiovisual media productions under the creative control of indigenous people from Latin American regions have flourished since the 1980s. Through these audiovisual media productions, Indigenous people take control over their stories, challenging mainstream narratives that see them as subjects of study. However, there is limited research on how academic libraries acquire Indigenous audiovisual media productions, IAMPs, or IAMPs. That's how I'm going to say it, IAMPs. So, almost looks like lamps, but it is not. From Latin American regions, and the representation of these materials is scarce in current vendor offerings, compelling libraries to develop alternative acquisition pathways. This story explores IAMPs from a library acquisitions and academic distribution perspective, focusing on opportunities and challenges associated with expanding acquisition pathways in the United States. First, we conceptualize audiovisual media productions under the creative control of Indigenous people and survey the literature and acquisition practices for this media. And then we examine findings from 13 interviewees involved in the IMP industry, including producers, realizadores, film directors, colectivos, Indigenous collaborators, and educational distributors. Our study concludes gaps in acquisition and distribution of IAMPs can be addressed by building reciprocal collaborative partnerships with Indigenous creators and educational distributors to increase the representation of IAMPs in library collections and educational distributor product offerings. And Ibacache is from University of Colorado Boulder, and Arthur Aguilera is also from UC Boulder. And I don't know if you're picking up on this, but we are having a very nice rainstorm to listen to. Very soothing. But I want to talk to you, so here we are. Background: conceptualizing Indigenous audiovisual media production. So, no audiovisual media production definition encapsulates all moving pictures under the creative control of Indigenous people from Latin America. Some scholars refer to Indigenous audiovisual works as Indigenous media, Indigenous videos, Indigenous films, or cine indignica. Indigena, sorry. And that was probably the French pronunciation too. Cine indiga. I can't do Spanish. I'm locked on French. In 2013, Houston Wood's analysis of Indigenous predictions found as it was impossible to develop a single Indigenous perspective, able to adequately engage with all the work in Indigenous filmmaking now being produced across the globe. Yet in 2014, Pamela Wilson et al. Defined Indigenous media as forms of media expression conceptualized, produced, and circulated by Indigenous people around the globe as vehicles for communication. In conversations with the scholar Peter Baker, Kichwa directors Alberto Menuala and Frida Menuala rejected the term indigenous to distance themselves from that ethnographic label. In 2024, Mixtec filmmaker Dinazar Ubina agreed that indigenous peoples are diverse in multiple territories and nations and argued that the category of indigenous cinema causes the audience to distance itself from it. Before this, in 2017, Mariana Lacunza referred to breaking free from the romanticized and paternalized representations of indigenous persons, an observation Baker also reiterated. So, Pecha director Dante Serrano highlighted the idea of creative control by differentiating between indigenous audiovisual artists and indigenous films. Hopefully, I said that right. Citing Juan Batasso, Francisco Gomez Terrin stated that the view of the indigents supposes a narrative led by a dominant class, which acted as an intermediary for native people who in turn pushed back against representations created outside their cultural world. He added that many ethnographic or anthropological documentaries reflected a decontextualized and external view of the indigenous. As a rebuttal, when indigenous communities took control of their stories through audiovisual productions, they responded to years of ethnographic documentary and external representations. So our study builds on librarian Daisy Dominguez's 2004 paper, which defined Indigenous film and videos as produced by and/or under creative control of Native people. Dominguez included films produced by non-Indigenous persons in this definition when these works presented Native people's perspectives. In 2024, Javier Mignot Diaz, Kathia Ibacache, and Leila Gomez invited librarians to think about prepositions by with when building a film collection that is Indigenous and that incorporates works that represent collaborations between Indigenous and non Indigenous partners. Our study complements Dominguez's conceptualization following Amalia Cordova and Baker's Notion, done in 2005 2023 publications, respectively, that this media is multifarious in the production methods, styles, and formats it uses, purposes it seeks, audience it targets, and topics it covers. So, what are some acquisition practices for audiovisual materials? Limited research exists on Indigenous audiovisual media acquisition practices from Latin American regions. Libraries have long purchased audiovisual media despite high costs and ever evolving formats. Current acquisition models require librarians to navigate a hodgepodge of sources, pricing models, delivery platforms, licensing terms, and limitations. In 2022, an Ithaca S&R study on streaming media acquisitions found most respondents purchase physical formats and have increased their investments in streaming media subscriptions and single title licenses, which are primarily sourced by only a handful of vendors, namely Overdrive Canopy, Clarivate Alexander Street, Infobase Films on Demand Films Media Group, and good old Swanks Digital Campus. For your film and media librarian, Deborah Lee considered this barrier in her 2023 Indigenous Studies Library Collection Development Toolkit, where she advised readers to consult publicity materials, film festivals, and library subject guides, and to directly engage with film producers to identify materials for this collection. So, on to distribution of Indigenous media productions from Latin American regions. So, seeking to delineate the distribution productions international network for Latin American films, Luisela Alvarez stated that the distribution within Latin American regions occurred through television, media festivals, and the internet. Other distribution networks for Indigenous media include transnational Indigenous film festivals, commercial big screens, and media sharing sites such as Vimeo and YouTube. Citing Nicholas Garnham, Munio Diaz, Ibacache, and Gomez emphasized economies of scale favored distributors more than producers because producing an audiovisual work was more expensive than distributing it. Munoz Diaz, Ibacache, and Gomez added that financial power and market control based on a few vendors and buyers built an unequal relationship among the audiovisual industry stakeholders. For these authors, independent platforms struggled financially in this global environment, but could progress through a more reciprocal relationship based on fair payment and the diffusion of marginal content. In these circumstances, Indigenous communities often must set up horizontal distribution networks rooted in reciprocity and mutual obligations that result in free screenings for Indigenous communities and limited distribution to academic institutions that view the knowledge and culture as fungible. There's a fun word. Discussing Latin American Spanish online videos, Jesus Alonso Regalado concludes that communication between libraries and video vendors and developing a mutual understanding are crucial to bringing online videos to academic libraries. So, what's the methodology? This research, approved by University of Colorado Boulder Institutional Review Board, encompasses 13 semi-structured interviews conducted on Zoom between October 2023 and November 2024 with an average duration of 60 minutes per interview. Authors emailed invitations and consent forms to each participant. At the end of the interview, the participants received a copy of the Zoom recording and the transcript. Interviews were conducted in English and Spanish. Authors manually transcribed each audio recording to fix errors in the Zoom produced transcripts. Ibacache transcribed audio recordings in Spanish and then translated them to English. Our thematic analysis adapted coding procedures developed by Clark and Brown. Individually, we coded the transcripts with observations related to our research examination, and then in conjunction, we compared the codes, integrated them, and grouped them into themes that best captured the responses. Like all good social science. So here are some themes. The heterogeneous nature of Indigenous audiovisual media productions resists Western-induced labels. Yeah, that makes sense. So there is no universal definition for Indigenous cinema. Definition of Indigenous cinema depends on context in which it is developed and the level of creative control and participation of Indigenous people and local considerations. I'm going to skip the very heavy quote blocks, okay? You want to read those, you can boot this up and look at it yourself. Film training for Indigenous creators provides an essential pipeline, but there is limited availability of formal film training for Indigenous creators. Film schools that recruit and train Indigenous creators may be vendors that libraries can tap into, which makes sense. And then Indigenous audiovisual media productions span diverse formats, purposes, topics, and genres. Indigenous audiovisual media productions are not genre themselves. They manifest in many forms and genres. Yeah, because they're just tied to a creator. They're not, yeah. IAMP is more than an Indigenous language in a film. Indigenous languages respond to cultural heritage construction. Indigenous audiovisual media productions have diverse audiences. There is a strong interest in IAMP reaching a broad audience. Academic audiences are identified as key targeted groups. Indigenous creators participate in all stages of film creation process. Indigenous peoples may be involved in all stages of film creation from initial conception through distribution. Collaborative partnerships generate mutual benefits. Cultivating respectful reciprocal partnerships between distributors, media creators, and academic institutions is a key goal. Some more themes. IAMPs have diverse distribution pathways. IAMP strives to enter established distribution pathways such as film festivals and reach out to commercial distributors, but often has to rely on self-distribution methods. Distribution to universities in the United States is challenging, and due to various obstacles, Indigenous creators from Latin America have difficulty reaching the academic market in the United States. Distribution wishes and challenges for IAMP creators. So creators want their films to be watched, discussed, and help enact change. They face challenges distributing their works due to a lack of connection with distribution partners. Distribution wishes and challenges for producers. Producers want to establish relationships with academic institutions and libraries, but are unsure the best ways to get in contact. And then there were distribution wishes and challenges for educational distributors. So distributors want to distribute the IMPs as part of efforts to build a diverse catalog for customers. Communication and technical challenges hinder this work. So Table 2 listed organizations who participate in the interview, and Table 3 lists all the indigenous people, languages, and geographic regions mentioned in this study. So here are the organizations and the individuals. I'm going to kind of scroll past all this exciting stuff. Here are the peoples mentioned and their geographic and linguistic abilities. So, a lot of different people. And I'll admit, I'm pretty ignorant of all the people. I know Quechua because I digitized some of their tapes. But these are all your languages. Here's all your geographics. All right. So participant demographics. Participants represent a small sample of creators, producers, and distributors involved in IAMPs from Latin America or educational distribution. We organize interviewees into stakeholder groups using terminology provided by the interviewees. Realizadores represent filmmakers or directors who work independently or with a production company. We also use the word colectivo to denote community and collaborative representation in audiovisual works creation and decision-making processes. Although sometimes participants' work crosses to fulfill broader responsibilities, for example, a producer could also be the realizador. For the purpose of this day, we consider them as identify themselves during the interview. Finally, we refer to educational distributors to describe organizations that target university libraries with their products. The interviewees had a variety of expertise and work experience across different geographical regions in Europe and the Americas. 5 interviewees identified themselves as part of production companies. The realizadores, 3 interviewees, performed production work. 2 participants were members of collectivos, and 1 respondent identified as a non-governmental organization focused on creating and promoting productions by indigenous women from Brazilian territories. 2 participants were representatives from educational distributors actively working with academic libraries in the United States. So, limitations. Our study has 2 limitations. First, finding participants involved creating and distributing IAMPs was challenging. To address this issue, we relied on contacts from whom we had previously purchased film licenses. We also searched the internet, social media, and related film festival catalogs to gather the names of additional participants and consulted with film scholars for potential contacts. One scholar refused to provide contact information directly, alluding to privacy concerns. Ultimately, we found 51 people to go interview. Second, the first 5 interviews were conducted in English as initially planned. However, we decided to revise research design to allow interviews in Spanish because one of the principal investigators was a native Spanish speaker. After we received approval from our institution's institutional review board, remaining 8 interviews were conducted in Spanish. A quick pause here and we'll get to the findings. So, on to the findings. The heterogeneous nature of indigenous audiovisual media productions, aka the inverse of homogeny. The indigenous vision is not the same as the West or has the Western view, and that has to do with the realities the communities experience. Sometimes you think everything is the same, and it is not the same. There's no consensus on what terminology best reflected IAMPs because these works represent various productions, persons, and communities. Some terminology refers to cinema from a geographic region, such as Quechua cinema. The realizador from the Colectivo Moyu noted that he never used the term indigenous in the interview to avoid a term used to stigmatize communities. Mulu also stated that cinema should have an identity based on topic and aesthetic, but should not be the only factor when categorizing this media. Terra Nostra expressed similar sentiments, referring to the indigenous label as a discriminatory term that feels like a ghetto. Distributors use terms such as indigenous cinema to capture all media about and by indigenous people. Creators differentiate between cinema made by indigenous community and cinema created by an individual who belonged to a community. Some of the interviewees feared the labeling of indigenous cinema could lead to a dualistic romantic view of their identities and cultures. Sephra noted cinema created without indigenous participation is not indigenous cinema, highlighting the need for indigenous creators to be represented in the film creation process to be considered indigenous. So, film training for indigenous creators is going to be an essential pipeline. So one feature that set some participants apart was their involvement providing film training to Indigenous people via workshops and informal school settings. 7 of the 13 interviewees provided education and skills development for Indigenous communities via film school. The interviewees considered film schools a crucial source of training in film creation development for Indigenous people, especially when formal training was scarce in some locations. The Maya Sot Still Realizador noted it was important to enhance skills because Chiapas did not have a film school. Some interviewees noticed a symbiotic relationship with the film school where they had a subsidiary providing training and development for Indigenous filmmakers. In this combined setting, the film school was free to students, and the productions were co-created with the production company. The production company then sold the films to generate profits and reinvested some of the proceeds into the film school. The work of the producer, Colectivo 68 Voces, exemplified a symbiotic relationship when alluding to the role of community elders in selecting important stories they shared. 68 Voces also involved children from the community through workshops in which the kids communicated stories through drawings, which inspired future productions. Referring to film, the Realizador from the Colectivo Muliu stated that it was important for Indigenous people to inhabit spaces that have historically not been inhabited by us. The interviewees also acknowledged the relevance of training beyond film schools, a pivotal point gathered in the interviews with some interviewees knew little about the academic market in the United States and felt it relevant to receive training on licensing, distribution rights, and other post-production matters. So, Indigenous audio media productions span diverse formats, purposes, topics, and genres. It is not another cinema genre, but it is different from conventional cinema. It responds to other types of collective community processes, which have other types of purposes. IAMPs span all formats, including feature films, documentaries, docufiction, short films, and television programs. When referring to the purpose of their work, the interviewees share common purposes for creating audiovisual works. Multiple interviewees mention political and social activism nature of their productions, whereas others use the medium to push back against racist stereotypes and cultural assimilation. Some interviewees know that these audiovisual works made Indigenous stories visible and raised consciousness for critical topics such as saving sacred land, supporting judicial proceedings, safekeeping community memory, strengthening the roots of identity, and raising awareness of Indigenous knowledge. Yet, thematic advocacy was not the only purpose. Some interviewees wished to demonstrate Indigenous film creators could generate quality works of fiction and nonfiction and discuss them in an educational setting. The interviewees also indicated that cosmovision was very relevant to them. Regarding genres, one Collectivo noted that their audiovisual works represent different aesthetics and genres, including magical realism, comedy, romance, drama, and horror. IAMPs are more than indigenous language in a film. The interviewees referred to various languages, from indigenous languages spoken in the south of Chile and Central America to those in the Caribbean and North America. A representative from CFREC noted a compelling point regarding the use of indigenous languages in films. Making a film in indigenous languages is not the same as promoting indigenous cinema. He was alluding to films made without indigenous intellectual contributions, but that added indigenous language to access government funds meant to promote IAMPs. Our findings on language also highlight contrast between dominant society spellings and those Indigenous people preferred. Referring to the views of a Stotstil Relazador, Terra Nostra shared that Stotsil was written with an S and not with a Z, and that changing the S to a Z was an alteration Dzotsdil that anthropologists had created. The Relazador from the Colectivo Muliu stated that language is important in our work, which is a process of constructing narratives, and language itself is an element of people's communication. Yeah, that's why we try to be nice about the English language while it's degrading. All right, Indigenous audiovisual media production for diverse audiences. The producers, realizadores, NGOs, and colectivos listed general and specific audiences as their primary viewers, but it was educational distributors who specifically targeted higher education audiences, as well as academic departments specializing in particular subject areas such as anthropology, Latin American studies, Indigenous Native American studies. Realizadores were interested in reaching as broad an audience as possible, observing it was important that their films went beyond their territories, extending to global audiences that can make an impact through their work. The producer and Quadramento affirm that it's important for us to make these stories travel because it's their point of view of the story. That's why it's important. It's not a Western point of view of their lives, it's themselves telling their stories. So, multiple interviewees noted young people and students as their primary audience, especially higher education students. The filmmaking production company, Cabo Pro Films, stated, "Our intention is young people can reach the knowledge and stories of a world that seems to have vanished but hasn't." Interviewees also noted the importance of reaching broad audiences that combat the romanticization of Indigenous people and topics. For example, Encuadramento stated, "We think that, not always for good reasons, Indigenous projects are always very attractive for foreign audiences, sometimes because they have this vision that's more romantic or something like that." So, Indigenous creators can participate in all stages of the film creation process. Apart from the educational distribution companies, all the interviewees engage with Indigenous people in making producing audiovisual works, but Indigenous participation varied throughout the stages of film creation. Indigenous people participate in development, pre-production, and production phases, and others participated in all the phases. Some Indigenous people were involved in the idea formation of a film, screenwriting, and storytelling, research, filming, and providing input on the soundtrack. Others were involved in film's editing, final cuts, and production, or as crew members, cinematographers, actors, directors, reporters, photographers, and translators. Each film process was the opportunity to provide educational experiences where Indigenous creators received film training. Collaborative partnerships generate mutual benefits. The NGOs, producers, and collectivos indicated a strong commitment to co creation with Indigenous filmmakers, which they saw as equitable and fair. These collaborations relied on input from Indigenous and non Indigenous creators by with. The most essential elements of these co creations comprise of validating Indigenous people's point of view and stories, making decisions about the production and distribution of the work cooperatively, and securing equal ownership and sharing a profit. The producer, Cabo Pro Films, noted, "We respect, we don't steal images and stories, we work together, it's part of our ethos, we learn that with them." Similarly, some interviewees noted their interest in relationships built on the values of reciprocity, Agni. Cabo Pro Films declared, "In our latest production, this is a word that is very clear to me. It's called Agni in Quisha. Anini means reciprocity. I work with you, you work with me, we respect each other, you give me something, I give you something, we share. This is the ethos." The producer, Enquadramento, raised the issue of representation to highlight that communities represented in a film must approve of such representation. "It doesn't make sense to us, at least, to have a film where we arrive like aliens in the region and say, no, you should do this and that's it. No, it doesn't make sense. We need to collaborate, so that's it. The representation we make should make sense to them, not only to us." Collaboration also expanded to include conversations with Indigenous communities and research organizations. Collaborative partnerships were present in different stages of film creation and distribution. The Lazadores advocated for collaborative processes that gave them equal input on script and autonomy over their knowledge. There was special interest in the post production and distribution phases, where it was important for IM creators to voice how their media was distributed, including advocating for spaces that provide open and free access to their work independent of the licensing contract. Correspondingly, some producers added that these collaborative partnerships necessitated managing expectations. The producers noted the importance of building long term relationships by being transparent about how the film would be created and funded, how profits would be distributed. Regarding academic spaces, interviewees considered the value of collaboration in generating discussion and reflection beyond politically constructed representation, educational theories, and concepts. So, more on distribution pathways. Interviewees distributed their works in multiple avenues. Some respondents sold digital files and hosted university, school, and museum screenings. Others tried to reach nonprofit or government agencies. Two interviewees were able to negotiate having their content broadcast on television. Self distribution practices include posting film online on free video sharing sites like Vimeo and YouTube. The interviewees also know distribution improved due to advances in accessibility of filming technology, cell phones. These digital technological advancements facilitated the transition from physical DVDs to digital streaming formats, favorably contributing to the distribution process. Of all the distribution pathways, the interviewees agreed film festivals were crucial for distributing audiovisual works because they created exposure for Indigenous works, leading to higher discovery, financial prizes, and a connection to the educational market.
However, there were barriers to the festival pathway. One prominent barrier was the feeling of being boxed into indigenous film categories, referring to the quote ghetto category, end quote. Recalling the experience of a Stottsill filmmaker with the Berlin Film Festival, Terra Nostra indicated that this realizador refused to present her movie if the only category available for it was under indigenous cinema. Other barriers were meeting audience expectations and having mixed feelings regarding the importance of indigenous focused film festivals. And distribution to universities in the US is challenging. Across the board, interviewers expressed a strong desire to have their works distributed and discussed in educational settings in the US. The interviewers believed higher education supported collective reflections and advocacy around audiovisual works that function as tools to bring societies, cultures, and nations closer together. The realizador from the Colectivo Milieu is suggested that generating debate based on their work was essential to develop conversation in academic studies. Several interviewees perceived the United States to be an influential country. They mentioned that reaching academic audiences provided an opportunity to fight back against folkloric and romantic stereotypes assigned to indigenous people. The Stottsill Realizador observed educational spaces give value to our work. This helps to eradicate false narrative we are stupid and don't know how to do things well. In this sense, IM creators and producers viewed their work as knowledge sharing and advocacy tools, but there were difficulties. The producer Enquadramento commented, "We are producing the films because we want them to be discussed, we want to tell a resonant story, and people debate it." However, they know the market of the US is much more difficult for non English films to enter, and Quadramento continues. For example, I would never know how to offer a film to your university. It's not easy for me to find you and figure out how to offer it, and with each university, contacting each of them is crazy for us. Some participants entered into direct agreements with universities and distributors. Realizadores and production companies have reached educational institutions through invited film screenings and exhibitions. Selling digital licenses to universities was less common, but there was much interest in this acquisition method because physical formats were sometimes difficult to produce. Sometimes librarians write us asking for the movie for their library and we don't know what to say. They would say you need to send a DVD. And for us, it was complicated because to send a DVD from Mexico, we have to make a partnership with an organization in the United States, and we don't have this. Now we know it's not necessary to send a DVD, and that thanks to people we've met and information we received, it's possible to propose the digital site licenses to universities so they can have a file and organize a screening. So, some distribution wishes and challenges for the IM creators. Film creators largely wish to build relationships with distributors and their audiences, but they also seek for their work to be contextualized, valued, and distributed beyond their physical borders. Agencies over their stories is vital for the realizadores, collectivos, and producers, forming collaborations for new productions and knowledge transmission. However, participants also refer to difficulties. Some interviewees know the disadvantage of films staying in their own country and difficulties communicating with distributors, affecting opportunities to reach the academic market. The producer in Quadramento declared, "As filmmakers, we try to make the audience of the films as wide as possible, but there is a situation here in Brazil where most Brazilian films only have an open door in Brazil after they premiere in a country with a special festival." Other challenges relate to payment and language barriers during negotiations and the opportunities educational distributors miss out on by not attending film festivals to learn about new audiovisual works that may be relevant to academic audiences. Participants also referred to restrictive license arrangements and the loss of creative control. Regarding higher education, film creators know they were unsure how to distribute films to academic spaces or find distributors who would work with educational institutions. The realizador from the Colectivo Milieu stated it has been quite a challenge for Indigenous people to think about distribution, what the issue is like, how we can reach other spaces with our films. Due to these challenges, all the collectivos and realizadores rely on self-distribution, with three expressing an interest in developing their own streaming video platforms to disseminate IMPs. So, distribution wishes and challenges for producers. Producers are interested in the U.S. educational market and understand the importance of alliances with higher education. They value film screenings and invitations to provide lectures. They also appreciate transparency about the acquisition process, look for fairness in academic licensing, and seek information about including films in classroom activities. Producers also desire to build professional relationships with librarians and understand their work. Tara Nostra noted, "We would want to know better how librarians and universities make their choice to decide to get some movies and the criteria used by librarians to choose these kind of movies." Producers also saw academic support in the form of financial opportunities and the adoption of films in the curriculum. There are also challenges. Producers dislike competing with large blockbuster film studios and losing artistic control. Similar to film creators, producers encounter geo restrictions that limit the reach of their work to a specific geographic region, or films receive rejections to major commercial distributors without any feedback. So, more distribution usage and challenges for educational distributors. The two educational distributors recognize the value of building a diverse catalog with as many indigenous languages as possible. They view themselves as mediators between the film world and academic institutions. Sometimes these distributors seek the license of a specific film, while in other instances they request a broad catalog from a filmmaker or studio. Distributors stated that when they were interested in acquiring IMs, they had specific academic audiences in mind, such as constituents from Latin American studies, social studies, and indigenous studies. The distributors also know that IAMs were essential for developing transcultural skills, and distributors could work directly with producers and/or sales agents to acquire films for their platforms. These distributors are aware of libraries' budgetary constraints, recognizing that annual subscriptions provide fair pricing. The distributors also showed interest in including invisible voices and keeping films out of the minority closet. However, there were barriers. One distributor noted that locating IAMP creators and films in an indigenous language was difficult. Additionally, one distributor and one producer reported concerns about film and sound quality, such as features filmed on cell phones. Lastly, language barriers make negotiation and communication challenging. Although educational distributors know the importance of including Indigenous voices on their platforms, they recognize issues with purchasing single titles and complicated payment transactions. They emphasize that films in Indigenous language had to contain subtitles and mark records had to be created for customers. One distributor observed it is not ideal for us because we prefer to have as many titles as possible, so we prefer to establish agreements with vendors with an interesting catalog, and sometimes we have to go title by title. Several respondents did not have experience with educational video streaming databases, but they had exposure to commercial streaming video providers. The most common challenge was navigating complex exclusive distribution agreements, which the interviewees saw as limiting the creator's freedom to show the films. The Stotzel Realizador noted that one of the big problems with streaming platforms is they think they reach everyone, but in reality, they do not, because the internet does not exist everywhere. Not everywhere there is the desire to subscribe to these platforms, or simply bandwidth is not enough. But of course, for the rest of the world, with that infrastructure, it will be possible for those people to see the movie. I'm split in half. On the one hand, I wanted to because it saved me some of the emotional and physical work of promoting the film. But on the other hand, I feel like if these films I make are essential for the context where the internet does not exist or streaming does not exist, you have to carry those films on foot or in vans. And those are the two situations, but I do not want to. I would like to find a streaming platform that gives me this freedom. All right, give another little quick sip here. And the soothing sound of the rain is back. So, this analysis focuses on mapping selection criteria, understanding educational media market from creator, producer, and educational distributor viewpoint, and examining reciprocal collaborative partnerships. So, what are the mapping selection criteria? We start our discussion by referring to IAM's heterogeneous nature and its implications on selection criteria when building an indigenous audiovisual collection from Latin American regions. As librarians involved in the acquisition and collection development of indigenous authored materials, we have experienced the intricacies of identifying what an indigenous audiovisual work is. Is it a film with indigenous actors directed by a non-indigenous person, or a film referring to indigenous people from an ethnographic and anthropological standpoint, or films presenting a topic of relevance for indigenous persons from their perspective but without their creative control? These questions were endless and somehow tended to disconnect the intellectual contributions of indigenous and non-indigenous persons. We found several scholars attempted to reinvent definitions for films and videos under the creative control of indigenous persons without consensus. However, the interviewees gave us a clearer sense of the intricate conceptualization of IAMPS and, in a way, reaffirmed the definition that Dominguez made, acknowledging the contributions of non indigenous collaborators by, with, in the production and distribution process. The interviewees helped us appreciate that, whether referring to long or short features or nonfiction works, animations, still cinema, Quechua films, or community based videos. As Sefrick noted, cinema created without Indigenous participation is not Indigenous cinema. Notwithstanding, libraries should consider that some creators may prefer to separate their works from their identity. This reminds us not to generalize all audiovisual media created by Indigenous creators as a single genre and invites educational distributors to expand beyond the quote unquote ghetto category of the quote unquote Indigenous cinema label. Acknowledging the complexity of this categorization may help us to consider selection criteria with flexibility as a starting point in the library acquisition process and subsequent educational distribution. However, as we move forward, we could also prioritize metadata bibliographic records and include terminology that Indigenous creators use when working with library vendors or developing acquisition processes. Our findings show that IAM span diverse formats, purposes, topics, and genres, all possible variations for selection criteria, and which could appeal to a library collection trying to satisfy curricular and research needs. For example, animations and short fictionalized and non fictionalized documentaries could easily be introduced in classroom activities because of their brief length, especially if these works cover topics of curricular interest. Similarly, the interviewees mentioned the presence of social activism as a purpose of their productions, discussing topics such as stereotypes, identity, cultural assimilation, and other issues that courses in the social sciences and humanities may cover. Notably, Sh- Shiwi, sorry if I murdered that, argued that indigenous media are tools to challenge common perceptions about indigenous people, a sentiment confirmed by respondents who refer to their works as tools of empowerment designed for expressing specific messages and fighting back against stereotypes. Promoting IAMS as a research and reflection tool for campus constituents is one way librarians can argue for their adoption in the curriculum. Another critical element of selection criteria is the presence of indigenous language in audiovisual materials, and more if its role is to assert the cultural heritage the language carries. We sense the connection of language and cultural heritage when the Staatsil Relazador and Terra Nostra purposefully referred to Staatsil cinema, highlighting the importance of language in nation. However, Seafright cautioned making a film in indigenous languages is not the same as promoting indigenous cinema. This assertion revealed the sensitivities of the increased number of famous films that, although they include indigenous language, it is unclear how much indigenous creative control they have. This is the case of well-known features such as Embrace of the Serpent, Retablo, and Roma, which have an indigenous language, but it is unclear how much indigenous intellectual contributions they had or whether those contributions were remunerated, i.e. paid. Another interesting detail was the spelling reference in the word Stotsil. The distinction of the spelling of the word Stotsil with an S instead of the English spelling with a Z used by anthropologists reminds us of the clashes with academia. There is an unspoken view that academia constructs indigenous people without them. This consideration might sound trivial, but it matters regarding bibliographic records because we should utilize the terminology accepted by the corresponding indigenous people instead of the terminology constructed by the dominant society. Always a fun subject heading debate. Selection criteria also consider the target audience. So, in the case of academic collections serving disciplinary studies such as education, target audience may expand to various ages. When we collect audiovisual works to support higher education members' curricular and research needs, some works with a target audience of K-12 students also serve as essential materials that future educators can use in their curriculum development. This was the case of 68 Buses, the short videos made with Indigenous children illustrations and inspired by community elders connected with heritage and education. Age-related audiovisual materials also allow academic libraries to discuss IAMS from an all-age inclusive target audience perspective. It is more than a question about age-appropriate materials because academic libraries may or may not serve K-12 students as directly as public and school libraries do. However, it is a matter of materials that future K-12 teachers may want to use to create their curricular or classroom activities, as well as materials that faculty and students may utilize in their research projects, even if these materials target younger audiences. All right, understanding distribution from creator, producer, and distributor viewpoints, reciprocal collaborative partnerships. Our findings show that IAMS had diverse distribution pathways, including commercial and educational distributors and free to view channels like Vimeo and YouTube. The notion of free access resonated powerfully with interviewees because sharing audiovisual works is part of reciprocity wisdom, a way of paying forward to the communities collaborating in the production or simply sharing knowledge openly and without a paywall. Crazy talk. Apart from these platforms, many interviewees agreed that film festivals were crucial for distributing their works because these festivals provided exposure, discovery, and a connection to the educational market. As librarians attend book fairs to learn about new books in the market, attending Indigenous film festivals can be another acquisition path for librarians and educational distributors. This method to find IPES requires a budget, intentionality, and planning, especially because academic institutions usually cannot purchase films at the time of their premiere and must wait until the festival circuit has been completed. Nonetheless, attending film festivals offers an opportunity to locate these audiovisual materials and, more importantly, forge relationships. Another benefit of attending film festivals was uncovering IAM's different aesthetics. Cordova noted that many indigenous works are targeted at an indigenous audience with non-mainstream pacing, dialogues, and script formats. This is especially important because established distributors grapple with licensing materials that challenge mainstream aesthetics. For example, a slow pace or perceived low film quality may negatively impact a film's chance of being included in an academic vendor's offerings. Nonetheless, aesthetics open a window for non-mainstream audiovisual representations, emphasizing the role of librarians offering access to these works and inviting distributors to accept these non-mainstream aesthetics in their catalogs even if they do not align with the conventional media representations. There may be times when librarians must expand beyond traditional vendors to establish distribution relationships directly with indigenous creators and organizations. Study also revealed that distribution into universities in the United States was challenging without a straightforward acquisition process for finding and purchasing IAMP. On one hand, we learned that traditional film acquisition practices for higher education, such as buying DVDs or licensing streaming video, were novel concepts for Indigenous creators, and costs and technical barriers prevented them from participating in these formats. On the other hand, creators celebrated streaming licenses as a format that would allow them to deliver digital files across borders. Still, nuanced licensing terms and payment structures were challenging to navigate. Despite these challenges, creators and academic distributors strongly desire to distribute IAMP to academic audiences. Producers, realizadores, and collectivos' wishes surpassed the mere monetary compensation for their work. What mattered to the interviewees was cultivating a space for open dialogue and reflection. Naturally, creators and producers need money to keep producing films and training, but the nucleus of their work relies on thematic and creative knowledge sharing followed by discussion. The juxtaposition between money and knowledge sharing communities communicates to academic libraries the importance of negotiation over pricing. Instead of budget being primary concern in decision making, one could focus on bringing to universities the representation of many different ways of knowing and creative expression at a pace that works with our budgets. This assertion does not refute the importance of budgetary restrictions on academic libraries, still, it inverts the focal point and welcomes negotiations about the item's price and use from a reciprocal perspective. Both educational distributors we interviewed appear to have IAMP among their indigenous collections. Pragda's Indigenous Peoples Collection features Indigenous people in Latin America, and Digitalia Film Library offers a small number of films tagged as Indigenous. As of the writing of this paper, Canopy hosts 707 films labeled Indigenous Studies and 339 films labeled Indigenous, with overlap between those two categories. Alexander Street's Indigenous Peoples Collection provides access to audio and video resources that broadly include ethnographic films about Indigenous people. This data confirms educational distributors have a working acquisition model that could easily integrate IAMP. We also acknowledge that a bridge is needed between IAMP creators and producers and educator distributors in the United States. Okay, quick little sip here. IAMP creators wanted to understand how librarians acquire films on these platforms and how they could be included in these database products. Additionally, several respondents did not know about distribution rights, how to offer their films, educational video streaming databases, who to contact in academia, how licensing works, or the role of libraries in distribution. Therefore, librarians may play a bridging role, helping creators connect with these database providers who describe the benefits of working with universities directly. Lastly, a relevant unspoken barrier for distribution was the language barrier between distributors and creators. Surprisingly, we noticed interviewees and librarians shared similar challenges related to language barriers during initial negotiation process and end stages of payment. We assumed that just like not all librarians spoke Spanish, not all those involved with the selling and distributing of IAM spoke English. We noticed these language barriers during the interviews, which attested to the importance of having bilingual librarians involved during acquisition process. Overcoming this language barrier is indispensable considering creators and producers' appreciation for transparency regarding academic licensing. This transparency can translate into straightforward license contracts, stipulating a price that includes bank transaction fees, and ensuring that IAM creators do not lose artistic control, a topic of concern to them. So, reciprocal collaborative partnerships, a recurring theme in all the interviews, was collaborative partnerships rooted in trust and fairness, invoking the notion of aini reciprocity, where IAM creators has meant working with Indigenous and non Indigenous allies to develop stories, fund them, and produce them collaboratively. For librarians, aini could manifest in establishing equitable and fair negotiation prices where our decisions are made cooperatively and transparently. Another way librarians can invoke the theme of aini is by ensuring bibliographic records capture the names of directors, photographers, languages, filming locations, and indigenous communities. To some extent, academic librarians are well positioned to practice reciprocity by sharing knowledge about the library acquisition process, including license agreements and pricing structures. In addition, reciprocity may also mean librarians can connect creators with educational distributors for information about film distribution, technical and curatorial aspects in the United States. From an acquisition viewpoint, contemplating collaborative partnerships opens the path to assessing materials under the creative control of Indigenous people and by with produced works. For academic libraries, this consideration implies more than assessing subject matter and format. It unlocks conversations about knowledge creation and representation in our collections of works conceived and created outside the norm. So, a short little tiny conclusion. This study represents the first examination of IAMPs from Latin American regions through an acquisition, educational distribution perspective within the United States. By focusing on opportunities and challenges, we hope to start a new conversation about acquisition pathways and deepen our understanding of the complexities surrounding IAMPs. As films continue to enter the higher education curricula in various subjects, we hope this study offers a glance into the views of some of the creators and producers of IAMPs and academic distributors. Indigenous creators and educational distributors face many difficulties that impact the ability of libraries to purchase and provide access to IMPs, and for librarians, examining these views and challenges may be a starting point to bridge the gap in acquiring and distributing IMPs from a better informed position, guided by principles of reciprocal and collaborative partnerships. Then I'll have some credit statement, and then you can see in the appendices, consent forms, exciting stuff, and then we get into like the notes, and I think that's all she wrote. So yeah, we gotta build some better pathways. I think that was the main takeaway from this. It's hard to get them, and there's very few sub collections, and you don't necessarily want to be classed as indigenous, which I can understand. Someone who's queer media, you don't necessarily need that to be the entire standout if it's not like something you directly discuss. But anyway, you've hung out for about 45 minutes, and hopefully this at least gave you something to think about in terms of diversifying your collection. Um, yeah, I wish we had more fun. That's all I'm gonna say about that. Hope you guys have a good Easter coming up. Those of you that did Lent, good job. Those of you that didn't, it's okay. We're all sinners. That's the great thing about life, right? Right.